Are modern cameras making us worse photographers? It's only in the last couple of years that buzzwords like dynamic range have come about. Really, years ago, nobody actually gave a rat's about dynamic range. And when we talk about dynamic range, we mean how capable is the camera of picking up the extreme highlights and the extreme shadows. A camera with greater dynamic range will be able to pick up more information in the highlights or the shadows than a camera with lower dynamic range. This then gives you more flexibility when it comes to editing as to how much information you have to play with. And in situations such as trying to take a photograph with a very bright sky but a very dark foreground. And if you expose for the sky, your foreground is going to be too dark. If you expose for the foreground, the sky is going to be all blown out. The Sony a7 III, for example, has phenomenal dynamic range. So if I'm exposing such a photograph, I could underexpose the image so that the sky appears correct, and then bring back the shadows in post-production and get a more balanced image like I was going for in the first place. In the pre-digital era, that kind of editing, that extreme pushing of highlights and shadows was not possible. If you wanted to get a landscape image exposed correctly, you had to do it in camera. You had to do it there and then. So you would then be forced to use things like graduated filters to balance the sky to the foreground before you took the picture. Now, obviously, filters are still an option in today's world, and a lot of photographers still use filters to get as close to the finished image that they can in camera and minimize on how much editing they have to do afterwards. Now, I'm not saying that huge dynamic ranges and the ability to edit the living hell out of an image and make it look nothing like it was originally captured is a bad thing. It opens up more creative possibilities to people now than have ever been available. I think modern technology has allowed the ability to create good images more accessible to a lot more people. But I think it's made us better artists. I actually think it's lulled us into becoming worse photographers. And I do include myself in that statement. Because there's been times when I've taken a photograph of something or other, and there's something that I've seen that I'm not entirely happy with. It could be something slightly off with the lighting, it could be something in the background, it could be any number of things. And rather than retake the shot and get it as close to perfect in camera, I just think, it'll be all right, I'll fix it in editing. Now, for small, minute things, that's not a huge deal, and most people probably wouldn't notice. However, I think there's a lot of instances where people rely far too heavily on the ability of the camera and post-production to try and replicate a look that they should really be trying to create in camera. Take, for example, a backlit sunset portrait. You want to get your subject visible, but you also want to see the sky behind you. And if you expose for your subject, you're going to blow your sky out. If you expose for the sky, you're going to underexpose your subject. Not a problem with modern dynamic range. You just expose for the sky and then bring back your subject in post. Whereas, years ago, you'd be forced to take flashlights and brollies, and you would have to light up your subject to balance out that of the background. Except modern dynamic range really cannot replicate the look of true natural light. The way that light will fall off on your subject and create kind of cast-in shadows and that three-dimensional look. You do not get that by just recovering shadows. You could replicate it in post-production, but it's probably going to take you 3 weeks of editing to do it, so it would have been just a whole lot quicker to use a light in the first place. I'm not saying that dynamic range is a bad thing, because, video shooters have less dynamic range available to them than shooting raw pictures, unless you're shooting raw video, and that takes up a whole lot more space. So better dynamic range is useful there. There might be times where additional lighting just isn't possible. I've had a few wedding ceremonies before where the service officials have said, I'm not allowed to use any flashes during the ceremony. But then the room might have, some areas of bright light from big windows and some areas that are more shaded, and it's going to create some very unflattering light. And I can't change the light that's there. So the only thing you can really do there is try and balance it out in post-production, and that relies on the capability of the camera sensor. So I know I, for one, in the past have relied far too heavily on the abilities of the camera and the editing to correct for something that ideally I should be correcting there and then at the time. So it's my New Year's resolution to try and get myself out of this mentality of it's all right, I'll fix it in post-production, and go back to the realms of actually getting it right in camera to begin with. But what's your photography New Year's resolution? Leave your comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.